Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Confer Zoom session. We are working on unit number 4, which is East Asia today. Today we're working on East Asia. You can see chapter 4. I'm Mr. D, and it is Tuesday night, and we're finally finished with March, thank goodness, after tonight. Let's see. So let's start tonight with talking about where we're going for the next 2 weeks. We have our 4th quarter material. Right here, you can see we're doing chapter 11, which is East Asia tonight, but I'll show you the other places where you could find material as well. Okay, so here we are, the last 2 weeks of classes. We'll have a student break on Monday. That doesn't count for us. That is the wrong one. No, that's ours. That shouldn't be in there. We have no Memorial Day here. There we go. So we'll have our Confer Zoom session right now. We're going to talk about East Asia, which is also the free book, the Finlayson book right here, number 9. We have our South China Sea assignment coming up this week and next week. It is due next week as we talk about Southeast Asia next week. And then, let's see, Wednesday, the April 8th, and then Saturday, April 11th. Next week, we cover Southeast Asia, which is both insular and maritime, and then the last chapter we cover is Australia and Polynesia, or Oceania, I should say, Oceania. Okay, you can see here we have a Confer Zoom session tonight, the last day of March. Our homework for East Asia is due Sunday night, the 5th. Then next week we have our Confer Zoom session. It's the last day to post extra credit. And I'll show you a bunch of extra credit today if you like. Remember, you have 1 per day you could do. Then Wednesday night, the 8th, is when we have our South China Sea video, South China Sea homework posting due. Okay, there's a bunch of stuff on there. You don't have to read every single article, but you should read a nice smattering of them and watch some of the small videos we have. And then Saturday night, April 11th, the night before Easter, is our last class, is our last due date. We have chapter 13 and 14 due. The responses to the readings are due on the 11th, and then exam 4 is due. Okay, you can see exam 4 is going to open up on Thursday. It'll be open Friday and Saturday. And exam 4 has 3 parts to this, as we'll see next week. I'll show you next week, but it's basically, it's the slides multiple choice true false section. You do that 3 times, highest score counts. Then we're going to have an essay and short answer questions, just like we've always had. And then there's a 3rd section that is dealing with the questions from the syllabus. Where is it? Right here. From page 4, I believe it is. No, page 3, page 4 at the top. Student learning outcomes. Okay, there are going to be questions that we've covered this semester that are related to these 3 major topics. Okay, and then we use that for assessments for your student learning outcomes. Did you learn what we asked you to learn and what you should learn coming out of this course? Okay, that's what the student learning outcomes are, and we'll talk about that maybe today. Talk about that. Okay, so we're going to move right in. You can see we're quarter number 4's material, which is right here. We have our Confer Zoom session now. We have cool maps and course drawings that I drew from the board. I think it's going to save it. Is it going to save it or just open it? Darn it, it's going to save it. I want it to open them. Okay, but that's an old, really cool picture. Let's see if I could bring it up at all. Now I got to save it to this. Download that. It's going to open. I wanted to show you. Of course, it's not. It's on there. Yeah, there's screen. Okay, yeah, I wanted to show you what we're working on with chapter 4, and then all these East China Sea. This is a really cool map from a long time ago. It gives you a different perspective of East Asia. Okay, you can see Taiwan, which is now, used to be Formosa. You can see the major rivers coming off the continent. Here's the east, looking at China from the east. You can see the Yellow Sea is home because the Yellow River flows into and splits up here and flows into the Yellow Sea, and a lot of sediment comes from the desert here. Beijing is to the north here. Here's Shanghai, one of the biggest cities in China, and then you got the southern mountains, very, very humid. And then here's Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Guangzhou down here. And then as you go further west, you get more and more mountains, much more drier, and then you get the Himalayas and Tibet all the way back here to the southwest, and then Mongolia is to the north, and then the Central Asian republics or countries are to the western border of China. Okay, so that's just one of the maps we have on there. Hey, Desiree, how you doing tonight?
Hey, I'm good.
Doing well?
Yeah, I'm good.
Are you safe and happy?
I'm safe.
One of the two?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. We are recording, by the way, just in case you wanted to say anything. Do you have any questions you'd like me to answer or talk about? I want to try and find my sheet.
Well, I guess that we can talk about that after you're finished recording. I just wanted to mention the classes that you opened last week, and they still say practice.
They still say practice, like the assignments?
Yes.
Okay, which assignments are those?
It was the homework for March 1st.
Homework for March 1st. Did I put those? I added some again, right? Where is my sheet?
I believe so.
I've changed some of those dates. Let's see, March 1st. March 1st is way back here in week number 3?
Yes.
Okay. And what's your question dealing with that?
You opened them for me well, you said that you were going to open them.
Hi, folks. I'm back. Sorry about that. I was just trying to show you different maps and different perspectives of East Asia. So we're starting with China and Japan, the Koreas, which are 2 different countries, but one nation. So it's one people divided by a political boundary. So here's our 4th quarter material. We did that already. Here's your 4th quarter material. The Pearl River Delta is a nice, I think I'm going to have to save every single one of these to show you these. I wish I could do it differently, but I don't know how at the moment. I don't want to waste the time to do it, so I'll just save them like this. So your free textbook material, it's not that bad. It's actually pretty good. Caitlin does a really good job on this chapter, and that's chapter 9 right here. I already have it up. Yeah, chapter 9, East Asia. She does East Asia and South Asia together. I think that's hers. Yes, East and South Asia together. So she talks about East Asia is the yellow, Southeast Asia is the pink, which we'll talk about next week. Part of the Ring of Fire, and I think she groups these together. So I'm trying not to use hers as much. The University of Minnesota book, which is the Dastrup book, has its own chapter separate just for East Asia, and including not just one page, but a bunch of pages. As you can see here in the bottom right, it goes introducing the realm. It talks about the main learning objectives. So it's a pretty good book. It doesn't have the bells and whistles that some books have. I don't see a lot of videos in here yet, but I think there is some a little later on. Okay, here are your slides. If you are still driving around or you're so bored at home and you want to listen to something that'll help you, there's some iTunes episodes from Dr. Mark Riesinger from SUNY Binghamton from 9 years ago. But then here is your internet assignment right here. This is due next Wednesday. Okay, and the topic is trouble in the South China Sea. It has become a flashpoint in terms of global politics and global strength and a superpower versus an emerging superpower. You can see here I've linked to the introduction of this issue. Okay, what is it? What's going on? The sides of the issue are 1 through 6 right here. They're photo essays, so that goes kind of quickly. And then other related stories that might interest you, not required. If you're into fisheries or ecology, there's a couple articles about that right here from National Geographic magazine, which is where I first started seeing this stuff. But it's two big bullies coming together over a piece of water, a piece of territory that has potential for great, vast wealth in terms of hydrocarbons, energy, gas, oil, things like that. And I've read 2 books about this area, and it's really kind of fascinating. The Chinese have been the big guy on the block around there for thousands of years. At one point, they claimed this whole area as theirs, but in the last 400 years, they withdrew and they've pulled back, and other countries have now claimed these areas, but they want to claim it again because of the hydrocarbons, the fuel for their economy. So we support a lot of the countries around there because we were the big superpower. We have the big boats and stuff like that. And Vietnam is now our trading partner. We've always been a big fan of the Philippines for over 100 years now. And then again, just to get in the way of this rising superpower, we're sort of trying to keep the peace there for as much as possible. But China sees it completely different. China sees it as a territory or water body that is close to them in their sphere of influence. Okay, and one of the books I was reading, it talked about it so many times that the South China Sea is to China what the what the Caribbean Sea is to the United States. Okay, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, this was our realm, and the Monroe Doctrine way back when said, you Europeans get out of here, we'll take care of business here. And it's somewhat touching the United States, sort of like this is somewhat touching China, but we're supposed to control that territory, that water body, because it's defensive, it's close to us, and it's in our interests. And China sees the South China Sea the same way, okay? Let me see if we could show you. Oh, that's a video. Okay. Okay, maybe I'm trying to show you a map of the South China Sea while I'm talking about it, and that's not going to work. That might work. Of course, I have people watching movies upstairs and doing iPad things. Here is the South China Sea. So here's China. Here's Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia. I want to say Burundi, but that's in Africa. Bahrain and Malaysia, they all try and claim this territory because there's a lot of oil and natural gas under there. China claims the 9-dash line claims all the way down here, which seems ridiculous in the 21st century. But this is the area that is highly contested. And China is thinking of this as our Caribbean Sea. It's close, it's our territory, it's everyone should stay out except for us. We'll run this thing. So that is your assignment for next Wednesday. It's due, the 8th. Okay. Here's the directions. Here's your rubric for the grading, and when you're ready to go for students, it's going to say, actually go down to the bottom here and hit reply, and that's where you do your assignment right there. Again, write it on a Word document or something you could save, proofread, spell check, look for capitalization, and then copy and paste it into this reply button with your name. Make sure your name is in there, and then when you reply to your fellow classmates, please state their name, talk to that person, be formal, and that way it goes much easier. Okay, and that should be Saturday, not Friday. Okay, So that's our assignment for next week. It seems like it's a lot of material. It's Saturday, good. Where was that? It seems like it's a lot of material, but it's really not. Okay, it's a lot of short articles and updates and things like that, which is kind of cool. But it could be the place that starts World War III, because the two biggest guns and bullies on the planet are going to face off there. Okay, that's the complete internet exercise number 4. And then here are the homeworks for chapter 11, 13, and 14, which are due the 11th of April. And then this one's the Sunday, the 5th. I extended the day a little bit for us because just what the heck, you need a break. It's the end of the semester. And then here's the exam, open up on Thursday, closing Saturday. Okay. So let's see if any of these are helping here, these pictures. All right, so that's Southeast Asia. We don't need that one. There's East Asia. This is sort of I drew this on the board showing you the elevation out west. Okay, the 5 stands, the Central Asian countries of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan's out there. The Tibetan Plateau is 25,000 feet with peaks over 29,000 feet, which is, Everest. 20,000 feet is most of the Tibetan Plateau. The Huanghe River goes to the north. The Yellow Sea goes to the North China Plain. The Mekong River goes to Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh City to the south through, I think it's 6 countries or 5 or 6 countries. The Sichuan Basin, the Three Gorges Dam. This is the Shangjiang or the Yangtze River. That comes all the way, there's the Three Gorges Dam, all the way down to Shanghai and the East China Sea, or the East Sea, or the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so that's one little way to look at it. Let's see this one here, East Asia, the outline. Looks like Japan looks like a roller skate. There's the Southeast. We'll do that later. That's kind of cool there. And the Pearl River Delta, this is a map and a population of Southeast China. Okay, you might know of it as the home of Hong Kong, okay, and Macau, which is an old Portuguese entrepot, and here's the old British entrepot. In 1997, Britain gave back Hong Kong to China with some stipulations that they stay separate. Obviously, this last 2 years, we've seen, especially this last year, we've seen a lot of revolt in Hong Kong as the Chinese government is trying to pull them back into China, become China again. And they're revolting. They're saying, no, this is not what the agreement is. You need to give us freedom that the rest of the country doesn't have, because this is what the agreement was. But Southeast China is the big, gigantic manufacturing center of the whole planet. It is extremely populous. 25 to 30 years ago, Shenzhen was a city of 5,000 people. Today, it's over millions of people. Guangzhou, which is the big, gigantic city all the way inland at the edge of the Pearl River here, that is a huge city, and all of this is all manufacturing. There are factories all over the place here. Okay, it's really, really crazy how big this area has become. It's unbelievably growth. The growth has been unbelievable. Okay, over the last 30 years. Okay, so you can see there is a big green district that separates Hong Kong from mainland China. Okay, Hong Kong's 7.3 million people. Shenzhen is almost double that at 13.55. It used to be 5,000 people. Okay, Zhongguang is 10.3, and Guangzhou is the largest in the region of almost 15 million people, which is just staggering. Guangzhou is it's a staggering amount of people. Okay, but again, 30 years ago, these were small little farming communities that had a lot of like black market trading with Hong Kong, because you weren't supposed to trade with Hong Kong. But I had a friend who grew up in Hong Kong staring at China, it was all green and rice paddies and forests. And now that's not that at all. So that's South China, Southeast China especially, and that was this map, Pearl River Delta, conurbation. That whole region has, at that published time of that map, was 135 million residents, which is roughly 40%, 45% of the whole continental United States or the whole population of the United States, just in that little section. Okay, so that's the introduction to East Asia and your homeworks that you need to be working on. Okay, so let's quickly go into the slides here and talk about, you know, things that are in your textbooks, and both textbooks, and things that are somewhat important. I'll do it really quick for us. Okay. So Desiree, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. So this is Asia, and this is a map that's been compiled by satellites, and I think this is a space shuttle or something like that. But it shows you areas that are populated and have electricity, which means money and an economy. You can see here's Moscow all the way to the west. You can see the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the northern branch coming through Mongolia, the southern branch going all the way around to Vladivostok. You can see Japan is lit up like a Christmas tree. There's Tokyo, there's Osaka, there's the Kaijan Plateau. Sorry, I missed that word. I'll look at it later, sorry. You can see Taiwan, and most of the cities in Taiwan are facing China, and the mountains are to the east, so it's sort of like a big tilted mountain, a tilted piece of land where the east coast, the west coast towards China is a little easier. The east coast is all mountainous. You can see the Philippines. You can see the coast of China, which is unbelievably packed. Okay, and then here's eastern China, where the flat or somewhat flat areas are. Oops, sorry. And then beyond that is the mountains and the high deserts and the plateau, the Tibetan plateaus here, the Gobi deserts up here. Here's Mongolia, and then there's India. You can see the Indus River in Pakistan. We talked about northern Pakistan and Kashmir last week or last 2 weeks ago. Here's Delhi, here's Calcutta or Kolkata, here's Mumbai, and you can see the outline of India quite well. Here's Bangkok, here's Kuala Lumpur, here's Singapore. You can see the Southeast Asia area of China, that is Hong Kong and Guangzhou. There's Manila in the Philippines, and here's Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. But you can see that there's a ton of people here. Okay, a ton of people here. And the most striking thing is here's Korea, right there. It's one nation of people, so one people with same commonalities, same culture, same language, but it's split by a political boundary. And you can see the difference between South Korea and Seoul, the capital. It's all lit up. And North Korea has one dot for Pyongyang, a couple military places, and that's it. There's nothing in North Korea except people without electricity. North Korea is more populous than South Korea. There's much more of an army in North Korea than South Korea, but they have no electricity. Hold on, that might be wrong. I think South Korea has more people, but North Korea has a much larger army. That's what it is. South Korea is more populous, a much better economy, strong economy, but North Korea has a much bigger army because that's all they have, and they're protecting their little crazy world. Okay, so this is the world's most populous realm. Okay, obviously we have the biggest country on the planet, plus Japan. Taiwan's up there, plus South Korea. So you have those four big major countries, and you have Mongolia too, which doesn't have many people there at all. One of the earliest cultural hearths. It's been pulled in on itself and isolated from a lot of different parts of the world, and we'll show you why and how. Okay, China, most of the people, as we saw, live in the eastern section of China. Okay, the western section is high plateaus and deserts, as we saw with the population map, the light map there. Okay, and it's 4 times the size of the United States. China doesn't have a west coast. There's no California and Seattle and Oregon here, right? So you take all the people that we have on the west coast, throw it back east, and then multiply it by 4. And that's China. Okay. You can see how isolated this could be, this part of the world is. You have these big giant deserts, these high gigantic mountains, these really sharp mountains to the southwest, right? That's separated from Southeast Asia and Vietnam. There's only one little section there in Vietnam that's somewhat passable. Okay. To the east and south, you have ocean. To the east and south, you have ocean. To the north, you have the steppes of Mongolia and Russia and Siberia and Kazakhstan. Okay, big, giant, empty areas with small population pockets here and there. Okay, the Chinese were so afraid of Genghis Khan, they actually built this gigantic wall. Okay, to keep them from the Mongols. Okay, the only thing that is really touching them is the Koreas. And then you have Russia all the way to the east here of Vladivostok. And then Japan is off the coast. Okay, so it's further away. And that's why Japan has also been isolated, because they're an island next to a big country that wants to be isolated also. Okay, so you do have this inward-looking society. It's been the strongest nation on this planet a bunch of times in history. It had the hugest, I'm sorry, the hugest sound like a president. It had the largest navy or armada on the planet at one time in the 13 and 1400s. It went all the way to East Africa, brought back giraffes and other animals to the kingdom, to the Forbidden City in Beijing. It was the world power. And then they decided to burn all the port cities and burn all the docks, and they turned inward because it's China and they can do what they want. That helps their identity of being all for the country itself and all for one, because who cares about the rest of the world? We are the center of the planet. We are the center of the universe. We're the oldest, we're the largest, we're the strongest, we're the best society, and that's sort of the idea there. Okay, but you have natural protective barriers like the mountains and the oceans. It's far from Europe, it's far from India, it's far from Africa, and in the 20th century, it's far from the Americas. Okay, all right, so historically unified, it's been, they fought wars over centuries, and you have dynasties that lasted for centuries, and that includes the Korean dynasty, the Vietnamese dynasty, the Japanese dynasties as well. Okay. So you can see the low-lying areas are in green, and that's where it's absolutely packed with people. And then the mountains that sort of are like the Appalachians and the Ozarks, where it's not that bad in terms of elevation and relief. It's really wet. It's like the southeast United States here, where the moisture comes off the oceans. And then as you go past that big giant mountain range here, you have the Sichuan Basin, a little lower, great soils, reddish soils. And then you have deserts and high plateaus where there's not much people. Okay. So there we go. Rivers, the 3 major rivers. The Huanghe, or the Yellow River, goes through the Loess Plateau and the deserts, picking up all the yellow soil. Okay, that's to the north. The Changjiang, or we call it the Yangtze, or the Long River, is the lifeblood of China. It is the longest river here. It's the cultural hearth to the South China Plain. And then the Zhejiang, or the Pearl River, down here. The Zhejiang, or the Xinjiang, the Pearl River, or the West River, is draining the southern coast there. Okay, Shangri-La is somewhere over here, the Mekong River, the Changjiang, the Yellow, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Indus River, they all drain from the Himalaya plateau and the Tibetan plateau. And at one point, you have three major rivers, the biggest rivers in Asia, right next to each other in different valleys. It's really kind of crazy. It's kind of cool. Okay, the one that goes to Thailand, the one that goes down to Ho Chi Minh City, the one that goes to Shanghai, all within a couple mountain ranges. And the Huanghe, the yellow, starts up here as well. So just to show you the size and the latitudinal differences and similarities, China and the US are so similar in so many ways, except China doesn't have a West Coast ocean, okay? You can see the further north you get, it gets to be really cold, like Montreal and Quebec, right? The southeast is extremely humid. Shanghai is almost like Miami and Savannah. Guangzhou is like Havana. Chongqing is like Houston, right? And you go further west, Omarqui is sort of like Denver in terms of elevation, in terms of climate as well. Okay, so China is slightly, it looks slightly bigger than us. Of course, we don't have Alaska in here and Hawaii. It's about the same size, about the same latitudes, about the same width. It's that similar. And again, it gets the same sort of climate as we do because it's on the west side of an ocean, just like the United States is on the East Coast here. So you get the same humidity as we would in the United States. However, again, they do not have a West Ocean coast, so there's no cold current come down this side. It's just dry and cold because of this big giant landmass. Okay. So here are the climates that look just like the United States for the most part, but a little more extreme. Japan and the Koreas, that's kind of interesting. Where it's much wetter. This is more like Detroit, New York, Toronto, and then the further north you get, you're now moving into Montreal or Minneapolis, those type of climates. Okay, the further south you go, it's more and more like Havana, Cuba, Miami, Houston. The further west you go, obviously it's more desert, more dry, very cold at night, stuff like that. Okay. So here are the comparisons between the United States and China in terms of climate maps. For our physical class, we talk about this a lot, being similar places around the world have similar climates. And we can see that right here. Okay, so in general, here are really basic maps, right? The further north you go, the colder it is. That makes sense. The further south you go, the warmer it is. This is true because we're in the northern hemisphere. Okay, you can see in Harbin all the way to northeast China, they have ice castles they build, and they have big winter festivals. Okay, just like the United States for the most part, the west coast is dry, the western side of China is dry, the east coast of China is wet and humid, just like the United States. Okay, all the way out in the Taklamakan Desert, you have oil rigs trying to find resources. Again, all the way out here, they're mostly populated by Muslim Chinese and people from the 5 stands that have sort of lived there for a long time, and then the Chinese Empire moved west over top of them, just like the American Empire, the United States Empire moved west over the Hispanic population that was here in Southern California. Same exact idea. Big empire expanding, conquering places like Tibet. Okay. Japan is very similar. It goes up and down the east coast like the United States. It gets really warm to the south like Miami, and it gets really cold to the north like Montreal and Boston. Okay, variable climates north to south. It's almost all mountains. There are very small plains. The Kanto Plain, the one I forgot before, the Kanto Plain is the Japanese homeland, the home hearth, right? And because it lies at the edge of plate boundaries, we have some nasty earthquakes, there's volcanoes, and of course, with those big giant earthquakes comes tsunamis. Okay. So you can see the hazards here in Japan. The whole eastern side of Japan facing the Pacific Ocean is susceptible to tsunamis because of this big subduction zone right here. Tokyo and Yokohama and Kawasaki, the largest human city on the planet, or human urban area on the planet. The yellow areas are sort of low, flat plains. So you can see that there's not many areas to grow food in Japan, except if you terrace up the mountain and hillsides. Those areas that are flat and warm and hospitable are now filled with people. So you have to bring in a lot of food to feed the population of Japan. But you can see the major volcanic eruptions. You can see all the red dots up and down the east coast, up and down the whole island coast. You can see those volcanoes. Number 8, I think that is Mount Fuji. Yep, number 8 is Mount Fuji. Outside of Tokyo, outside of our sister city down here in Redlands called Hino, which is a suburb of Tokyo. The old capital is Kyoto, which is kind of confusing because Tokyo is the new capital. Kyoto is the old capital during the Meiji Revolution. They moved it. Remember, forward capital, we saw that in a couple different countries. The Japanese moved their capital to this beautiful, wonderful harbor, and the city of Tokyo exploded after the 1850s. Okay. Korea, you don't have the volcanic activity, although there is a super volcano all the way to the north here that is, well, we hope it's extinct. But there's a super volcano up to the north here. We don't want that going off anytime soon. It's, as you saw from maybe the TV show or the way old movie called MASH, they're supposedly fighting in Korea. It gets really, really cold in the winter. It gets really hot and humid in the summertime. The south is mostly agricultural, more flat territory, alluvial lowlands. You can see that in yellow. The north, although it does have flat territories, it's more mineral deposits and hydroelectric resources, and that's what it uses to power what little energy and what little electricity they have. Okay, the DMZ is a political boundary, and it's also a environmental boundary. I stopped off at Seoul for 14 hours on my way to Vietnam. I was not in the war. My friend's a Vietnamese refugee. We went back in '98. No big deal. But in Seoul, South Korea, right on the border, there is this gigantic city and then a sharp mountain range that separates north from south. And the further east and there are like 600,000 Northern Korean soldiers just sitting pointing guns at South Korea, ready to invade at any minute. Okay. But Seoul is the largest city right here, and as we saw with that big light show, the big lights at night, it is gigantic. Okay. Again, Korea is split into 2 different political units, although it's one big culture. It's one group of people. So there have been talk about reunification since the 1950s when it split up. But technically, they're still at war. They've been talking about signing peace treaties for a long time there. Okay. Taiwan is a tilted block, like I talked about earlier, the size of Maryland, mountains, plains, rivers, earthquakes, all sorts of crazy stuff there. And Taiwan is, China believes it's a breakaway province, and Taiwan wants their own independence and wants to be separate from China, but China's never going to let that happen. Okay. Questions at all, Desiree? That was a lot.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Nice introduction, right? Covers
Great.
everything. My throat's going, oh, stop, Mr. D. Okay. So that's the environmental section of the chapter, right? And then obviously with so many people, with a government that is just focused on keeping themselves in power for the most part, any way possible, you will have some environmental problems. Deforestation, obviously, especially in North Korea, because they don't have any money at all, so they just cut down trees to survive. Reforestation is sort of helping. You have desertification, especially out west. The land is turning more deserts. You have pollution, overcrowding, all sorts of crazy stuff here. And as we see, when you get humans and animals together in live farms, bad things can happen. Okay. Deforestation in the southeast because there's people need space and territory and fuel. Soil erosion. The Huanghe River, the Yellow River, flows through a desert, sort of like the Colorado River does. But it flows through a desert that is wind-blown sand and sediment. This whole area is wind-blown sediment we call loess, L-O-E-S-S, loess plateau. So the river flows through there. This is where people still live in sort of caves. They dig into this loess plateau, and there's cave dwellers there. Still 21st century, right? But that river gets its yellow name from all the sediment it picks up. And then when it reaches the North China Plain, it tries to flatten out and dump all its sediment because it's slowing down. So the Yellow River and again the Yangtze River have been notoriously bad for flooding and killing millions of Chinese over the years. Millions and millions of Chinese. So what the Chinese government did was they said, well, we're going to stop that flow coming from the Himalayas, from the plateau. We're going to build a dam called the Three Gorges Dam. It's a massive, huge, ginormous dam the size of the Golden Gate Bridge. If you've ever been to San Francisco, you see the Golden Gate Bridge, how wide and big it is. That's all concrete, and put that in China, and there's your big giant dam. Okay. It's there to produce a lot of power and hydroelectric power to fuel this huge growth in factories and manufacturing in China. It's worked pretty well. Okay. We see tsunamis, soil erosion, Three Gorges Dam, the Yangtze flooding, and deforestation covered all of them. Okay. All right, so there's the Three Gorges. Look at how beautiful that used to be. And now it's all covered. The big giant thing. There's the Yellow River, the huge sediment load. You can see there the giant yellowish sediment. There's the Loess, L-O-E-S-S plateau. You can see people living in these islands and these mountains. Terraced farming, one of the poorest parts of China. There's not much farmland, stuff like that. Okay. Let's see, energy. Obviously, it is a big deal because you have 1.3 billion people living there, 4 times the United States size, and you need to give them energy. So you can see it's mostly run on coal, which for a long time was great. You know, it's perfect because they have a whole bunch of coal. The United States has a whole bunch of coal. We use that to grow our economy. And now as we're moving past there, China is like, no, time out. We still need all this stuff. Plus we need everything else. So there's the hydropower that's growing with the dams. The nuclear power is barely anything. Natural gas is getting a little bit bigger, but not that much. And you can see oil and coal are the biggest energy uses in China. Okay, still, and this is 6 years old. Maybe natural gas, which is the green, has gotten a little bigger, but coal, they're still digging up coal. They're still burning coal, and you can see it in the atmosphere. You can see it in the photochemical smog. You can see it in the nasty air that they have in these big cities. Okay, and they're trying to go to renewables, but they've got so much stuff. It's really hard to move, hard to change from that. Okay, you can see the population areas. North China is the most densest part of the country. Of course, South China is just ginormous amount of people. Okay, there's the Sichuan Basin, or the Red Basin. So when you go to Chinese food and you order Szechuan beef or Szechuan pork, it's coming from this region, which is Szechuan, and it's also red soils, a lot more iron in the soils, so it's a red basin, they call it. It's the home of, well, I'll wait for that one. The Szechuan Basin, the Szechuan food comes from there. It's spicier as well. That's the spicy part of the country. There's Wuhan, famous for the COVID-19 outbreak. There's Shanghai, the Wild West, the big city where the East meets the West. So China would meet the rest of the world here in Shanghai and have all these different conventions. And this is the place where the Western Chinese could actually trade and work with the Eastern and the rest of the world. Okay. There's Beijing, the big capital city. There's Seoul, Pyongyang. Shenyang is this old industrial city to the north. Harbin is the big city up there. And then, of course, Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagasaki is down now. A small little city. Nagoya, Kyoto, these are big population centers. Okay. So Japan and South Korea are more densely populated than they appear on this map. They're both highly concentrated in cities, and most upland areas remaining are relatively sparse. So you have all the people in the low-lying areas where there's water and you can grow some food and you build houses, and all the mountains tend to be not as populous. Okay, so birth rates, growth, all sorts of crazy stuff. Okay, this is Japan, this is China. These are our population pyramids, or what do we call them? Age sex diagrams, gender diagrams. You could see Japan is in trouble because they're not replacing their population. Okay, you can see the big baby boom from after World War II. You can see the baby boom's kids right here. But since the 40 years ago, so we're talking 1970, right? 1980, we've seen a reduction in population in Japan. Well, not a total reduction, but a reduction of growth rates, less and less children. Okay, as people are moving to the cities, they're realizing that they don't need as many kids. So they're having one child because it's expensive. And because of that, you are not having a large population to support the elderly, to support the children. You're not going to have that population, the working force. So they're really facing a demographic challenge. China, on the other hand, is facing a completely different type of demographic challenge. Okay, at one point, they were a very rural community, rural population, had 500 million people after World War II, right? After the communist revolution, the Maoist revolution, 1960s, early 50s, late 50s, I think it was. Then Mao said, Chairman Mao Zedong, he took over and he looked around, he said, Russia is this communist country, they're really big, they're gonna beat the crap out of us if we don't stand up for ourselves. India is really big, they're on the other side of these mountains, we need to make ourselves strong. So he told, the policy was, have as many children as you can. We're gonna be the largest country in the world again, we're gonna be the most populous, we're gonna be huge. And they had so many kids. Yeah, they just blew up. And then when Mao died in the 70s, they realized we are in such trouble. We have too many people. We put people out into the rural countryside, and it was a disaster. We lost millions of people with diseases and famine and government killings. And in the late 70s, they said, time out, we got to stop this. We got to change this around. So they introduced a one-child policy, which is exactly what it sounds. You could have only one child. It worked great in terms of demographics. It reduced the fertility rate, the population growth slowed and leveled out, but there's repercussions to that. And the repercussions include not having enough girls, okay? You can see the differences here. The boys are around 3%, the girls are under 3%, okay? Move to this one from 2000, okay? You can see there's 45 million or 43 million girls, there's 50 million boys. There's 55 million boys and 48 million girls. There's 62 million boys and 58 million girls. There's 51 million boys and 48 million girls. This is not natural. what they did, they wanted boys because culturally, boys are the ones that take a new wife and bring it to the family to take care of the boy's parents, leaving the parents of the girl without anyone taking care of them. Okay, it's a big deal, big cultural thing. So what people were doing, if they knew it was a girl, they would kill the girl in vitro. They would drown the girl like kittens in a bag. They'd not feed the girl. The girls would die, and then you could have another chance and you would get a boy. And that was a big problem for a long time. Okay, let's go back to the China one right here. Okay, so you could see the difference, right? You could see the difference between the boys and girls by just looking at those numbers. And some estimates are now at, there are about 28 to 30 million more boys looking for mates, looking for lifelong partners that are not there. Okay, they call it the you know, you've heard of family tree. They call it a family stump. There's nowhere to go. There's no family to have unless you steal people from other parts of the world, which is happening. But it's a big deal. It's a big problem, and they've tried to they've stopped that one-child policy. They said if your first child's a girl, please keep it, and you could try it again in 3 years. But a lot of city folks want just one child, and they want a boy. So it's very hard to overcome that. You could also see a big demographic change here. You could see this is 50 years ago, so 2020, so 1970, before 1970, when Mao was still in power, it was a country that it was a developing country, a country where kids died all the time. And you can see that pyramid right here, okay? In the 1980s, things started changing around. They started having more manufacturing. They opened up to the West in 1974 or 1972, one of those 2 years. They opened up again to the West so they could have now trading with the West. And you could see what it's done with its population. It has boomed in population. That's the one-child policy. That's the everyone have kids and then stop. But it's now with medicine, with modern technology, with some money coming in, it's no longer all communist. It's communist in charge, but it's a big capitalistic system below with modifications to keep the communists in charge. But you could see this is much more of a barrel shape in the last 40 years, last 50 years than it used to be, which tells you that there's much better medicine, much better living conditions for a lot of people in China. Okay. So here it is in bullet points here, the attitudinal shifts, the one-child policy. They did all sorts of things to try and stick and carrot people to change the idea. And the fertility rate became a problem. It was implemented in the 1980s. Growth rates fell a little bit. They had propaganda all over the place. Look at how wonderful your one child can be. Look at how life is. Look at your ancestors, which are extremely important. Look at your ancestors, how proud they are of that one beautiful little girl child, right? And that's a big thing. Of course, most of the children were boys. Okay, for a nation to thrive and prosper, give birth late. So don't get pregnant at 16. Give birth when you're ready for it, at 24, 25. Give birth to few, so just one child. And then be a wonderful parent, be an excellent parent. And that's the idea, that the propaganda, the idea of supporting everything for the country. Do it for the country. Okay. So this is from 2016, 17, 18, I don't know when this was. But the most surprising demographic crisis, the low birth rate. So you have too low of a birth rate now. It's dropped below replacement level almost. And the population is still growing because it's China. It's always going to grow, but it's slowing down a lot, slowing down too much. Okay. And you can see the difference between male and female. 1990s, 2025, they're probably going to start evening out a little bit more. Okay. All right, so Japan and Korea, there's agricultural issues because there's not a lot of farmland, and everything that is flat is filled with people. Okay. Anthropogenic landscapes, that is the human changed landscapes. Rice in the south, grains in the north, Loess Plateau. Talked about a lot of that stuff already. Okay. I'm moving through some of this here. I want to get to big picture items here. Okay, languages, obviously we do have, this is a big vast empire. It's a huge part of the world with many different types of languages. The Koreans are isolated to the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese language is isolated to Japanese islands. The Mandarin is most of China, but again, this is an empire. It's conquered other people. So Southeast China is completely different than Northern China. Okay, what is this one? This is light green, which is the Cantonese. The Cantonese are different types of Chinese, and the Cantonese are the ones that have moved to the Southeast Asia areas. Okay. Finn, Taiwanese, and then you have the Tibetans, you have the Mongolians to the north by Mongolia, the Zhuangs to the southwest, and then let's see, Austronesian, right? That's the little section of Taiwan that faces, some people think that's the genesis of the Polynesian. People left Taiwan and Taipei and moved eastward into the archipelago of the Pacific. I don't know about that yet, so, okay. So again, major ethnic groups, the Han is the biggest one, but you have others that they conquered, obviously. Okay. So questions at all so far, Desiree? Doing well? You listening good? Everything's going too quick?
Everything's interesting. I'm listening.
Okay, cool. All right. Geopolitical issues, we've talked about, we're going to read about the disputed islands, especially down here in the South China Sea, but they're also doing it with Japan. There's the Koreas, the two different Koreas, divided nations. Taiwan and China are also separated. There is border disputes between their neighbors, of course. It all leads to water, obviously. Japan, the Kuril Islands, this was a sort of a unfortunate for Japan. Japan was at World War II. It was at war with the United States, and Russia never declared war against Japan until, and I think one of the stipulations of the peace treaty in Europe was that Russia would join the war in 3 months to help defeat the Japanese. VJ Day is August, what is it? August 8th, maybe August 9th, August 10th, maybe something like that. But in between the dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, which was August, I think it was August 6th of 1945. Right after we dropped the bomb on Japan, Russia invaded the Kuril Islands because they always wanted them, right? And then we dropped another one on Nagasaki, and Japan said, all right, we're done, we stop. But in those 3 or 4 days, Russia invaded the islands and took those. So now they're claiming, both countries are now claiming those islands as their own. Kind of sneaky, but that's what you do at war, right? Okay, so spheres of influence, we talked about that a little earlier, the shogunate, the Meiji resolution, there's your history, restoration, that's your history side of Japan. Imperialism, you can see this big giant purple line is the Japanese Empire in 1943, so it controlled all of this territory at the height of their empire in 1943. Okay. You had British, you had French in there, you had German, you had British colonies over here, you had French colonies over Indochina. it was imperialism to the yin yang here. But post World War II, we call it post-war, but post World War II, U.S. and Russia sort of fought over this area. Japan lost a lot of territory, remilitarization, the Korean Peninsula, we had that war, and it's still going on for the most part. Okay, the Chinese territory thing. Okay, going back here, you see that the British, the French influences here, but Hong Kong was a British colonial possession. Macau was a Portuguese colonial possession. Okay. I talked about earlier, 1997 or 1998, the UK or Great Britain gave Hong Kong back to China. Okay. One country, but two systems, that's what they call it. So this is Hong Kong is the Wild West in terms of, hey, just make money and gives taxes away to the government. Whatever you do, it's fine. Macau was a big trading city and also a big gambling city that was returned to China as well. And you can go here, you can see some of the protests in the last 2 or 3 years from, that should be Hong Kong, Hmong protests in Hong Kong. Okay, anything else that's really going on here? Okay, demographics, we looked at the poor versus rich countries. You can see Hong Kong, how rich it is. Japan's really rich. South Korea is one of the richest in the world, and China's way behind. Growth rate, China is growing like a banshee, or was growing like a banshee. These need to be updated. But look at that. 27% of the population, 1 out of every 4 people in China is below the poverty line. Which begs the question, can China be a world power if you have 1/4 of your population impoverished? Okay. Life expectancy, Japan, obviously the highest on the planet. Hong Kong is pretty high too. That's actually higher for the males in 2016. But again, 80 is really high, and 87 for females. Wow, that's crazy. And South Korea is 86 and 79. Taiwan 77, 83, and China is behind those, but still kind of high. Look at this, under age 5. So 49 out of 1,000 births dies. That's a huge number in North Korea and China. Still, it's a huge number. Okay, and that was in 1990. You could see the advent of medicine and opening up to the West, how that has helped both China and North Korea. They take stuff from China, obviously. Where's the other one? They don't have it here. I think maybe it's the next one. All right, some things with Korea and and Japan. Okay, economically. In South Korea, sort of like what we see in Japan, the government has sort of helped certain corporations become wealthy and powerful. And they did that by giving tax money for research and development. Here in the United States with private industry, like say Tesla or GM, they would have to take their profits and put it back into research and development to produce things. In South Korea and Japan, for that part, the central banks and governments help these conglomerates, these big industries, like, oh, I don't have those anymore here, do I? No, I don't. It's one of my slides somewhere. Is it through here? No, that's Mongolia. I'm trying to look at and see if I have all those companies here. It must be a different slideshow. Okay, so these conglomerate are these big giant industries that have fingers all over the place. So you think of a company in South Korea like Samsung. Okay, Desiree, do you know what Samsung makes?
My phone.
Your phone, good, phones. What else?
Laptops, computers, TVs, appliances.
Appliances like stoves and refrigerators and washing machines and dryers, right?
Right.
They make everything.
Yes.
They don't focus on just one thing,
Right.
right? Which is what a conglomerate does. It has many different fingers all over the place. So if the TV industry goes flat, you're still doing well because you have the refrigerator.
Right.
And Honda's the same thing. Honda makes engines and cars, but it also makes generators and other things. That's a Japanese company that's sort of the same thing. Okay. But these chaebols, these are these big giant conglomerates. Samsung is one of them. You've heard of Lucky Gold Star or LG?
Yes.
LG. There's other ones. It's in another slideshow. I don't know why it's not on this one. But I need to find it. Maybe it's one of my old ones here. Let's see. Let me move this over and see if it's in here quickly. There it is. Okay. I'll put it right here, just for the heck of it, just for now anyway. Okay. It's a mess. It's coming from a different slideshow, but let me make it smaller so we can see it. There we go. Okay. So these automobile and electronic corporations, in Japan, they're called keiretsu. In South Korea, they're called chaebols. Okay, they're independent entities, strong ties to the government that helps fund the R&D, the research and development. And you might know some of these businesses here, right? Lucky Gold Star, or LG, Life's Good, Honda. What's this one? Do you know? It's a car.
Acura? No.
Yeah, it's Toyota.
Toyota? Okay.
Toyota, yeah, it's Toyota. There's Honda. There's a gold wing for Honda. There's the Mitsubishi, which is Korean. Hyundai, which is Korean. Okay. Lotte, Samsung, GS. A lot of these companies have a lot of help by the government. Okay. Those are some of these chaebols or these keiretsu. Okay. What else can I talk about that I haven't done already? Okay, we have the economic zones. They call them the special economic zones. When China was looking inward for 400 years, and the United States sort of opened them up in 1972, 1974, I think the official one was, China tried to pivot from a communist government to a more laissez-faire, capitalist society, but still in charge. You can't vote for anybody but me, but I'll let you make money, right? And they set up these special economic zones that had different rules, okay? And they could trade with the West. And obviously, the coastal cities were the ones that benefited the most because there was the ones on the ocean you could send ships across, okay? And you could see the difference. This is 1997. I think I have a new one of 2015, but showing you the richest provinces of China. And it's basically where there's trade, right? There's trade, okay? So Guangzhou, there's Shanghai right here, Shandong, of course, Beijing, but of course the West Coast, because you do have trade to the 5 stands. It's not huge, but it's big enough, right? So these are the richest part of the country is the coast, and the interior was falling behind. Sort of what we see in the United States a little bit, you know, the coastal elites and the flyover country, all that crap that people keep talking about. We're all humans, we're all Americans. But there is a big difference in terms of GDP, or how much money people make, GDP. And you can see that in this map of China. Okay. And this is a great little map showing what each country which each state, which province of China represents in terms of the GDP of other countries around the world. So this whole southern section, Guangzhou, makes as much money as Spain does. Right? Here is Portugal. All this is just as big as Portugal. So there's Mao Zedong. And anyway, there's KFC. So again, that opening of the West has now done some really cool things, like KFC is there. Brand new Lexuses and shopping. You can see there's KFC right over here in the background. Let's see any other ones I can't see. Sinclair is one of these. Here's Shanghai, one of the biggest cities, this huge long port, which is kind of cool. Here you can see the industrial housing. There's all one color for the most part, and that is different than other parts of the world, obviously. Shanghai is the biggest port. It's 37 miles long and receives 100 boats a day, or ships a day. And you can see Shanghai here. You can see here's the Coca-Cola. Here's the McDonald's that's about 4 or 5 stories tall, right there. There's satellite dishes. I saw one of my students saw something cool down there. There's McDonald's there. Big logs going right through the middle of the city. All sorts of crazy cool stuff there. Here's Hong Kong, and you can see the difference between the types of buildings in Hong Kong and Shanghai. Hong Kong was British for a long time, so it grew up with a different type of system. Okay, it's still crowded, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. It's huge. This is the old map we looked at earlier. It's got this airport that is absolutely terrifying. These big giant jets coming from across the world and landing right on top of your apartment for the most part. They've now built a brand new airport away from these people, but it still is a big airport right there. Okay. That's coming from China into Hong Kong and vice versa. And I'm just going to fly through these other ones here. Okay, there we go. All right, got through it. Any questions at all, Desiree? There's some cool Mongolian pictures here too.
I wanted to confirm, did you say Yukasaki or Tokyo was the largest human area on the planet? Which one?
It's like a big giant conglomerate of cities. It's a megalopolis, sort of like New York and DC and Boston are all sort of together. Mm-hmm. Tokyo is the same thing. They call it Tokyo. It's the big city, but it's Tokyo, Yokohama, which makes tires, and Kawasaki, the motorcycle city. Mm-hmm. All 3 of those are grouped in this little area.
Okay.
And that's the largest population center on the planet. I think it's over 35 million people there.
Oh, wow.
Which is the size of California.
Yeah.
Well, California is almost 40 now, but it's close. Okay. Mexico City is the second largest in terms of that.
Okay. And then you said both Russia and Japan claim Kuril.
Yeah, the Kuril Islands all the way up to the northeast here, yes.
So who actually owns it?
Right now, Russia has troops there.
Okay.
So they own it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All righty.
Okay. So you're going to hear another term maybe on a test or note somewhere called Jakota. Jakota. They call it the Jakota Triangle. And it's the 3 countries that are westernized and highly, highly technical. You know, the fastest internet speeds in the world are in South Korea. You know, you got the big manufacturing areas. You got high skilled labor. You have high population densities, really rich countries. These are the 3. Jakota, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. And you can see the large cities here. You can see the connections they have. And again, it goes all the way from like Havana, Cuba, all the way up to Montreal in terms of its distance. But the Dakota Triangle, giant cities, state-of-the-art industries, exporting stuff to all over the planet, global links everywhere. But again, there's vulnerabilities, as we saw during World War II. Japan overreached and bombed the United States because we were trying to take away a lot of their rubber, a lot of their sources for food and rubber. So they said, no, no, no. And then we said, no, it's us. We're going to get you back. But anyway, here's the basics of Japan. There's the population, Japan's core region, the expansion. Here's the big city right here. Okay. They call it the Kanto Plain, K-A-N-T-O. You see that in your notes right there, Desiree?
Yes.
The Kanto Plain. That is the flat area that is now all urbanized. A lot of people living in there. There's Tokyo, Kawasaki, and Yokohama.
Mm-hmm.
And then Redlands down the hill there. Redlands has their sister city, their twin city, right here in Hino, which is out western Tokyo. Which is kind of cool. And I think San Bernardino also has one of their sister cities as a suburb of Tokyo as well.
Oh.
So we do send students there. Every other year, I think we send students to Japan for 2, 3, 4 weeks or 1 week. I don't know what they do. And then they come back and send students here for a couple weeks or months.
Oh, okay.
I think San Bernardino sends people over there for a whole semester. And then Japan sends students to San Bernardino for a whole semester. I think that's how they do it. But it's pretty cool. Okay. So this is the largest urban area on the planet. Of course, you're sitting right next to this gigantic earthquake zone, right? Which is really kind of terrible. That earthquake can produce tsunamis. The tsunamis can wipe out Tokyo Bay if there is an earthquake. And Tokyo is one of the 3 world cities, the 3 alpha plus cities, the one that all this economic trade goes through. Okay, there's one for each of these big regions of the world. There's Tokyo, there's London, and then there's New York City, the 3 big economic centers of the planet. Okay, and if you listen to the news, you'll hear the New York Stock Exchange, the what's the Japan Stock Exchange called? I've been hearing it for years. The stock exchange in Tokyo and the stock exchange in London, those are the big 3 trading cities, the big gigantic cities. So if something happens to Tokyo with a giant earthquake and a tsunami, the whole world is going to go into a little recession, if not a big one. Okay. These are the population numbers. I think I last did this in 2018. You can see the US is at 316, Japan is 127, South Korea is 50, and Taiwan is 30 million people. North Korea is around 25. 2003, 2013, 2017, so I last did this 3 years ago. You can see Japan. Japan has fallen out of the top 10 because they have remember we looked at the population pyramid? They have a growth rate because they have less and less children. So they have a negative growth rate, almost of 2%, 1.5%, which is incredible. They've lost 2 million people in, 15, 14 years, where most other countries have added people. You can see in China has sort of leveled off, 1.8289, 1.357, 1.386, so it's still growing, but a lot less than it used to. India is going to pass them pretty soon. And you can see the United States, mostly this is through immigration. For the US, we are an immigrant society. Indonesia is catching up. They're 20%. Brazil, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh. Bangladesh passed Russia. Mexico passed Japan in the last 14 years. Okay. This is kind of cool. You can see Japan has a much larger elderly population. So 1 out of every 4 or 3 out of every 10 are over 65 years old, where the US is 15% and China is only 11%. Look at that infant mortality rate. That is fantastic. Which means for every 1,000 children that are born and take a breath, only 2 of them pass away before the first year, which is awesome. Ours is 3 times as bad at 6%, and China is 5 times as bad. Okay, so there's Mount Fuji, there's the bullet train, and then we're going to see all sorts of like pictures of Japan here. Okay. Just tons of pictures at the end here, including cultural stuff like what do they like to do? They love baseball games. Baseball is a big thing in Japan. You can see they have balloons, they have cheerleaders, they have bands, all sorts of cool stuff there. Sumo wrestling, anime, really spread out to the rest of the world, and it's exported their culture, which is kind of cool. Okay. Then you get the Koreas. The Koreas are separated by political issues, and you can see the South Korea versus North Korea, and then here is the DMZ right here, the demilitarized zone. So one side is north, one side is south, and they really don't talk to each other much at all. Oh, there it is. There's that thing I had earlier. Okay. All right, that's about it. I think I'm going to stop there. It's been 90 minutes, and I'm done for the day. I'm over this. So tired. So Desiree,
Okay.
do you have any questions I could help you with that I went really fast on?
No, that was it. That was pretty clear. A lot of information.
Hate to put you on the spot, but yeah. I mean, it's the largest populated area on the planet, and we just covered it in 90 minutes. So I mean,
yeah,
a lot
good job.
more in depth, but it's kind of crazy. But anyway, just to remind you,
I learned a lot. I've learned a lot.
That's awesome. That's what it's about. Anyway, folks, I'm going to sign off here in a second. Desiree, I'm going to hold her on after I stop recording here. I just want to ask her something. But again, here's your chapter 11 overview. If you go back to the topics, there's your homework. We did that already. Here's your 4th quarter material. So make sure you look at this stuff. Your slides, your homeworks, your extra credit, all sorts of cool stuff for you. One more thing. Here we go. So the extra credit opportunities, there's a lot of stuff here. Okay, there's some articles. There's actually, if you look up one of these, you click on this, there's the U.S. News and World Report with current events in Asia. So you could take any of these and use it as extra credit in our discussion boards. Okay. The news, it looks like every single thing around the world is about the COVID virus, the coronavirus, virus, the coronavirus. Hanoi and Saigon is talking about it. 5 more cases confirmed in Vietnam. They're banning all flights. Okay, so it's not just the United States that's shutting down. A lot of countries are shutting down. Okay, and that's from those extra credit. Where is that? Right there. The extra credits down here that you can do. Okay, but again, The Economist has stories. You can look at The Economist for extra credit opportunities, and look, it's COVID-19, COVID-19, COVID-19 all over the place. The Olympics, Japan cherry blossoms, all sorts of things. But these are extra credits for you. If you want to look at these articles, read them, and then write a nice paragraph about them, there's your 5 points right there. And you do that once per day. If you have issues in accessing any of these articles from The Economist, please get in contact with the library, and they will give you a password to go through the library to find these. Okay, because this costs money for you and me, but the library subscribes to some of these things. And newspapers as well. That's how you can do it, that newspapers. But go through the library and see if they could find an article for you. And that's their job. They love to do that. They really do. Okay. So anyway, that's it for East Asia. Next week, we're going to jump in and talk about Southeast Asia and Oceania, Australia. Okay. Have a wonderful afternoon. Good luck. Stay safe. Have fun. Stay at home. Take care of your family. And just try and relax if you can. I know it's stressful. I know it's hard. Please, if you pray for the janitors and hospital workers and nurses and doctors and sanitation and the folks serving food, you know, at the grocery stores and all that stuff. We're in trouble and we need help and support. So support anyone you can. Be safe though. Please be safe. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.